There have been many cryptic and enigmatic films commercially released since the creation of cinema, from German expressionist classics to the schizoid narratives of David Cronenberg and David Lynch to more recent virtual reality fiction. These films shun the so-called realistic narrative by challenging the viewer with symbolic visions and storylines that are physically impossible but pathologically significant. Some of these films are box office failures, but others successfully strike a balance by having enough realism to hold audience attention and enough intelligent surrealism to ensure repeated viewings and critical discussion. But very few of them have had the impact of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Many aspects of 2001 defy industry marketing conventions. It's incredibly slow-paced, has very little dialogue, very little physical action, no major Hollywood actors, no central character except perhaps the monolith itself. Much of the film has a cold, clinical look and feel, and its ending is confusing, terrifying, and completely at odds with the technical realism of the main bulk of the film. Executives are reported to have walked out on test screenings, and critics mostly pander as pretentious and self-indulgent. But against these odds, the film, like the monolith itself, overcame such obstacles and gradually drew fascination and even adoration from millions of film fans. Other surrealist films usually struggle just to carve out a small fan base. So what's different about 2001? One simple factor is its now inherent association to classical music compositions such as the Blue Danube and Thus Spake Zarathustra. This may have been deliberate on Kubrick's part. He did the same in A Clockwork Orange with Singing in the Rain and The Thieving Magpie. And who can hear the song Bird is the Word without recalling Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket? Musical association has been a consistent and powerful technique used by Kubrick to embed long-term awareness of his films in the collective psyche. Equally important is the obsessive attention to detail in the film's visuals, which is a constant reminder that we're not watching a spontaneously thrown together piece of work. Every shot has been carefully and precisely thought out. There's an inordinate amount of symmetry and progressive circular movements, and specific geometrical shapes are strangely repeated throughout the film's sets. We know there's a definite logic at work, yet we struggle to comprehend it because it's a logic we're not accustomed to, just as the apes are unaccustomed to the precise dimensions of the monolith. Although some reviewers believe the film concentrated too much on technological realism, Kubrick explained it as a precursor to the film's deeper themes. He told Charlie Kohler, "I felt that there should be no deliberately stupid mistakes, but obviously to get into the area that the story gets into, you have to move into pure imagination and use the factual elements as a means of building up dramatic credit with the audience, so that they are better prepared to move into the more speculative and purely visionary aspects of the story." Something else that has kept the film alive for audiences is that its style and themes have frequently been imitated or paid homage to in other films. Soviet filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky released a sci-fi piece in 1972 called Solaris, which is being called Russia's answer to 2001. The Disney sci-fi film The Black Hole combined Star Wars-styled action with a surrealist ending, somewhat reminiscent of 2001. The first Star Trek film included a surrealist, Stargate-like sequence, combined with a theme of vast alien intelligence.
I have successfully penetrated the next chamber of the alien's interior, and I'm witnessing some sort of dimensional image which I believe to be a representation of Beecher's home planet.
James Cameron has cited 2001 as being the movie that inspired him to go into filmmaking. E.T. ends with the drum roll from Thus Spake Zarathustra, made famous by 2001. The 2008 film WALL-E is, in part, an allegory of 2001: A Space Odyssey, featuring a HAL-like computer and robotized humans trapped by their own technology.
Otto, you are relieved of duty.
And Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life includes evolving universe shots that are uncannily similar to those of 2001's ending. Other filmmakers continue to play their part in keeping 2001 alive and well for modern audiences. All this in spite of a significant number of viewers who utterly hate the film because it doesn't conform to their pre-programmed expectations of how a film should communicate. We could assume that the popularity of 2001 has been based around its scientifically convincing depictions of space colonization and any optimism for the future that it might bring. Yet here we are in 2012 and we're still nowhere near the level of space exploration supposedly predicted in the film. Even in the 1984 epilogue of the novel, Arthur C. Clarke reluctantly admitted that the scientific progress suggested in the book and film is unlikely by the year 2001. But these simple factors haven't tarnished the film's reputation, and perhaps it's because, as Kubrick told Alexander Walker, it's not a forecast, it's a fable. But another key feature that sets 2001 apart from most surrealist films is that it can't be understood simply by reading the novel. There's been a wide misunderstanding by those who believe the film is simply a stripped-down visual version of Clarke's book. The film isn't an adaptation. The basic plot idea was plucked from an Arthur C. Clarke short story called The Sentinel, but was expanded into something much more complex, introducing new elements such as Hal and the surreal ending. So Kubrick hired Clarke to write a novel version while the film was already in production. Various biographical accounts reveal that Kubrick was contractually able to dictate how the book was written, and that, against Clarke's will, he deliberately guided the book and film versions in completely different directions. Reviewer Tony Macklin even went so far as to state that Clarke should be considered the film's first critic, rather than the only interpreter. Kubrick certainly agreed with this. He stated once in an interview, "Actually, it was an unprecedented situation for someone to do an essentially original literary work, based on glimpses and segments of a film he had not yet seen in its entirety." Even Clarke himself has expressed some awareness of the book and film divergence. When asked by Free Press interviewer Gene Youngblood whether Kubrick intended for the astronauts to appear inhuman, cold and unfeeling, Clarke replied, "I've wondered about that myself. You'll have to ask him." Clarke also expressed awareness that the film's investors weren't fully aware of what they were funding. He stated, "MGM is making the first $10 million religious movie, only they don't know it yet." If Kubrick had been so inclined, he could have ensured that the novel matched the film in terms of plot structure and themes, but it does neither. Usually a novel based on a film simply expands the narrative with additional scenes and dialogue, but with 2001, many scenes and details that are in the film are entirely omitted from the novel, or are radically altered. Here I'll outline a small cross-section of these differences, several of which imply major thematic differences with the film. In the novel, the briefing room scene is completely different, with a crowd of 40 people, wall charts, posters, and a very different speech. Page 75 of the novel mentions that the creators of the monolith being from Earth is not quite impossible. Floyd stands between the monolith and the sun, but can't see his own shadow on it. The Discovery sends a probe into Jupiter's atmosphere, which relays back images of a sea of mottled gold and a curiously symmetrical cone like a volcanic mountain, which is surrounded by a halo of puffy clouds, all about the same size, all quite distinct and isolated. This is completely missing from the film, but it sounds more like something from the film's psychedelic ending. In the novel, there are no chess games with Hal, and no newsreel interviews with the astronauts. The Discovery crew are told by Mission Control that several minor irregularities with Hal have been detected over several days, but in the film there is only one error from Hal, his prediction of an antenna fault. In the novel, the astronauts are ordered by Mission Control to disconnect Hal, at which point Hal cuts off the communication. This doesn't happen in the film. Also not in the film, Bowman tries to awaken the hibernating crew, but Hal opens the pod bay doors, letting the air out of the ship, and Bowman doesn't go chasing after Poole's dead body in the novel. After Hal is shut down, there's a long sequence in which Bowman, over several weeks, becomes accustomed to life without Hal, familiarizing himself with classical plays, music, poetry, and operas. Mission Control also reveals during this stretch that their twin 9000 computer suffers an identical psychosis to Hal's. Bowman is told that a Department of Defense study called Project Barsoom involved sample subjects being persuaded, with the aid of drugs, hypnosis and special effects, that they had met aliens. This is claimed to have been done as a test of public relations to a proposed announcement of alien contact. In the novel, Bowman travels to Saturn's moon, Iapetus, which is 6 times brighter on one side than the other, and Iapetus is repeatedly described as having the appearance of a huge eye, while the giant monolith is referred to in the title of the same chapter as Big Brother. Possibly related to this, we see a moon in the film that bears no resemblance to any actual Jupiter moons, but looks very much like an eye, and is curiously similar to the great red eye of Jupiter seen in the background. In the novel, Bowman's final encounter with the giant monolith occurs on the surface of Iapetus, not in orbit. The Stargate begins as he travels down into the monolith, which turns the universe inside out. But in the film, the shot pans up toward the direction we would expect to see the sun, the Stargate beginning in the opposite direction to that described in the book. In the novel, after travelling the Stargate tunnel, Bowman sees negative images of black stars against a white void, the universe seen in a film negative view. He sees abandoned alien spaceships and the surface of a giant red sun, which is then penetrated by a white dwarf star. In the hotel room ending of the novel, there's a TV above the bed, showing an African news commentator talking about wildlife. Bowman also sees on the TV screen a celebrity actor in the very same hotel room that he is already in. He then goes to sleep and dreams that his life is unreeling backwards like a tape recorder. He is reborn, the monolith reappears, displaying Stargate patterns on its surface, and then he travels into it. Again, this is all very different to the film. And finally, in another change from the film, the reborn Bowman Starchild explodes all the nuclear satellites orbiting the Earth. These huge discrepancies give the book and film independent lives of their own, and have allowed the film version to hypnotically maintain audience fascination. The sequel novels written by Clarke without Kubrick's participation and the sequel film 2010 have had little effect on the enigma of Kubrick's film except to elevate its reputation by inferior comparison. That's not to say 2010 is a bad film. It's quite good, but it hardly gets a mention because it's too conventional compared to Kubrick's film. I'm also not saying the 2001 novel is bad. It's excellent, and far superior to its sequels, which raises the question of how much the novel was shaped, or perhaps in parts directly written, by Kubrick. In fact, it seems that Kubrick wasn't as impressed with Arthur C. Clarke's writing stature as we might expect. At the Stanley Kubrick archives, I stumbled across a pre-production letter sent by MGM to Stanley, introducing to him the famous sci-fi writer. And Kubrick had written his shopping list on it: eggs, cheese, milk, and so on. A more specific example of Kubrick's mischievous sense of humour regarding his novelist for hire is described by Jeremy Bernstein in an article for The New Yorker in 1970. Bernstein was present when Clarke arrived at Kubrick's apartment for a production meeting, at which point Kubrick's daughters jumped up and down shouting, "It's Clark Kent, it's Clark Kent." That may sound disrespectful to Clarke, but I was surprised to read in an interview by Gene Youngblood that when asked about his feelings on the phenomena of hippies, Clarke stated, "If they drop out completely, I've got no use for them. Why don't they commit suicide rather than cluttering up the streets?" That's a very arrogant, politically ignorant, and inhumane statement. Ironically, the film 2001 was very popular with hippies.